Good morning. I'm David O'Malley, as you've just been told. I am an accidental entrepreneur. Entrepreneur in the common definition is somebody who starts a business and takes greater than normal risks. I prefer the definition for TED2016, where an entrepreneur is a voyager into new ideas and seeks to solve the greater problems, the more complex problems. In my own career, I've had some highlights. I worked for Charles Eames on exhibition design, particularly in Mathematica, which was an effort to take the principles of mathematics and represent them in three-dimensional models. Eames was a graphic artist, a furniture designer. You're sitting in his chairs here, the shell chairs. And then I had, as mentioned, the pleasure of being in a partnership with Frank Gehry for several years. This is before Frank became an icon. And then I was the head of a large international architectural and engineering firm. Then, to the point, I was hired by Summa Corporation, which is the estate of Howard Hughes. In other words, the heirs to the Howard Hughes estate. And Howard Hughes, by the way, was an incredible entrepreneur. He created Hughes Aircraft, Hughes Helicopter. He owned RKO Pictures. He owned TWA Airlines. He created the Hughes Medical Foundation, which still exists. Hughes, by the way, died in 1976. But he also owned hotels, casinos, and bought large tracts of land in Nevada and in California. And I was hired by the Summa Corporation, the estate, to manage or to take charge of the properties in California. This is one of the properties where Hughes bought in 1940, and in 1941 built a private landing strip, which then evolved into the Hughes Aircraft, and Hughes built and flew the largest plane ever built, called the Spruce Goose. It was built entirely out of plywood because metals were a critical shortage issue during the war period. This was at the end of the war. And it was meant to carry tanks and trucks and personnel. It only flew once, and it only flew that high. And the war ended, and the whole idea was dropped. But the principal piece of property in which you saw the landing strip and the building where the Hughes flying Spruce Goose was built is called Playa Vista. It was the largest privately owned contiguous piece of property in any major American city. It's 1,200 acres. It's over 3 miles long and over 1.5 miles wide at its widest part. It is surrounded by the city of Los Angeles, but was unincorporated. It was not a part of the city. So it had no zoning. So it had very little value as real estate. And of course, the heirs to the Hughes estate needed to maximize the value of any of the assets they had. And in order to do that, this piece of property had to be annexed to the city of Los Angeles, have adopted zoning laws and qualifications, go through enormous environmental issues because a large part of it was wetlands and it was in the coastal zone, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I viewed this as something more than a real estate venture. I viewed it as a chance to do city building. And the issue about city building had to be addressed in the context of the fact that this piece of property over time would change hands many times. It would take decades to build out once development started. And it would be subject to all the normal forces of the marketplace and changes in taste and design and new technologies. So we had to find a way to cut through all that noise of the annexation and zoning and so on and focus on what we considered to be the essence of what makes memorable cities memorable. And to do that, besides all the consultants and engineers and attorneys that we had working on the problems, I had to find a new brain. I had to find a brain with 5 distinct lobes. And the lobes had to be planning, landscape architecture, traffic planning, landscape architecture, as I said, government, and real estate law. Now, those are all obvious, possibly, except government. Alan Jacobs was that lobe of the brain. Alan Jacobs had been director of city planning in the city of San Francisco, city of San Francisco. And we needed someone as a part of the 5 lobes of this brain who could interpret how what we were doing would be likely to be interpreted by government and how it would be enforced and how effective it would be. But more importantly, we had to get to the essence of what is a city. And that was what this brain trust was for. We couldn't call it a brain trust, we had to call it a concept team because it's Summa Corporation headquarters would feel that, that we were making fun of them. So we had to find a way for this to function like a human brain. In other words, this group of 5 would only meet alone together. When they met on regular scheduled meetings, they met for 2 days and 1 evening in between, and there was no absences permitted, no interruptions permitted, and so they were functioning as the lobes of a brain would function together. When it came time to report to the board of directors, we had to express to them what all this meant, why we had this brain going, and what it was there for. As you can see, it recognizes that cities are built incrementally over time, but there is in that, the context of that, the notion of the public realm. In other words, if you can establish the public realm, the system of streets and open spaces for a city, then all the other things, if you make that embedded in the ordinances that you're writing, the drafting, the rules and regulations, if you can embed it in that, then the changes of market, the new technologies, all the things that would interfere and change the dream, nevertheless would be held together and create a framework, the public realm, in which lots of different things could happen. While we were drafting these ordinances, while the concept team was organizing this, we took pieces of it and sent it out to outside planners and architects to beta test. In other words, once you wrote all this, what would the real world do with that if it was functioning in the normal market? This represents a model of that 1,200-acre site. And you can see on the right-hand side, lower right-hand side, the original Hughes shed hangar where he built the spruce goose, and it's still there. And on the left-hand side, areas that were dedicated to wetlands and interpretation center and so forth. And the rest of it is, including a new marina that was added to the existing Marina del Rey in Southern California. This was just one way of taking all that information and putting it together so that you could visualize it and we could communicate it to the community and to the elected officials and to the heirs of the Hughes estate. The underlying principle, however, was the public realm, the system of streets and open spaces. Over the years, lots of different things have happened in Playa Vista. It's changed hands several times. A lot of what was designated on the left-hand side of your screen as buildable area is now all wetlands because it was traded for the destruction of wetlands for the expansion of the Port of Long Beach, et cetera, et cetera. Nevertheless, the underlying principle of a system of streets and open spaces remained. This happens to be a park designed on the basis of working functioning as a stormwater retention basin. So what the city said is you have to have a stormwater retention basin for a 100-year storm. And we said, well, what do we do with it between the 100 years? So we designed it as a park, and it could fill up if necessary or whatever, and obviously it wouldn't be used as a park. It's become an integral part of the community, which is all about this business of the public realm, because we had no control. You can't legislate good taste. We couldn't legislate the design of buildings, but we could legislate the design of the public infrastructure. So Playa Vista it's called Playa Vista, has all of this going for it, enduring all of the onslaught of new technology, new building types, and so on. There are 2 major neighborhood clubhouses and pools with athletic facilities or exercise facilities that are open to the entire population of Playa Vista. We didn't win all the battles. In terms of the system of streets and open spaces, city planning, the city traffic department has its own vision of what a residential street should be. And in order to continue with the plan, there were some concessions made. This is one example. It's a bad example. Most of the streets are much narrower and are tree-lined and so forth. All of the landscape, to avoid the ups and downs of city government and city operations and maintenance of parks and so on, all that maintenance is carried out by a private company under contract to the overall institution of Playa Vista. Everybody pays for that. One of the biggest shifts since the beginning of this was the dot-com industry. Google has taken an enormous amount of space in Playa Vista now, hiring thousands of people. Their private enterprise is building, Lincoln Properties is building thousands of studio and one-bedroom apartments to house all these people and so on. So it's become known as Silicon Beach. None of that existed when we started, but the framework that was created has been able to absorb that. The point of this is that brain trust, those five different people operating as one, were able to establish a framework in which all these different things could happen and endure. One of my favorite philosophers is Babe Ruth. And he said, as you can see, that the way the whole team plays is more important than any other single player, and what's important is how they work together. And that's what led us to the success, I believe, of Playa Vista. So I became an accidental entrepreneur when Suma hired me. I'd never been intended to be an entrepreneur, but in the end, the entrepreneur was not just me. It was those five people who drove that mission. Thank you.